Hello students, today we will discuss about another variant of realism that is called Subaltern Realism. In the last lecture, we discussed about John Mearsheimer's idea of offensive realism, which is based on power maximization principle. To him, states seek hegemony, not just security and survival, as Kenneth Walters argues. So they would be more aggressive than what Walters' defensive realism actually suggests. Then we discussed about neoclassical realism, which bridges the structural and unit level factors into its analysis by placing domestic politics as an intervening variable between the global distribution of power and foreign policy behavior of the states. In this class, we will discuss about subaltern realism given by Professor Muhammad Ayub, who in fact is an alumni of Aligarh Muslim University who focuses on international relations from what is called below, not from the top. In other words, it differs from neorealism and neoliberalism by focusing on the unique experiences and perspectives of the states belonging to the global south. It criticizes the Eurocentrism inherent in neorealism and neoliberalism, arguing that those theories overlook the historical and socio-economic conditions that shape the security concerns and political behavior of less powerful countries. It emphasizes the importance of understanding how colonial histories, economic dependencies, and internal social structures influence the international relations of the developing countries, whom we called also as countries belonging to the global south. It challenges the notion that the behavior of all states can be understood through a uniform theoretical framework. So let us start our discussion on Professor Muhammad Ayub's theory of subaltern realism. The theory of subaltern realism will be discussed through the following outline. First, we will discuss about the background of subaltern realism. Then we will discuss the major assumptions of subaltern realism. Then we will focus our attention on the conflict variables that are a major reason for intrastate conflict transform into interstate conflict. Then we will summarize and conclude our discussion with some major points. So let us start with the background of subaltern realism. In recent decades, especially after the end of the Cold War, neorealism has received criticism from numerous sources. As we discussed that, there was problem with structural realism, there was problem with offensive realism, and neoclassical realism combined the two. But with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union, some of the major arguments of classical realism and neorealism that did not remain relevant, and that's why there is another variant of realism that we call the subaltern realism. These criticisms have collectively shown that neorealism is unsuitable for explaining the behavior of majority of states in international system and the cause of interstate conflict, therefore damaging the legitimacy of realism as a separate theoretical tradition. So we already discussed that whatever the classical realists are arguing, whatever the structural realists are arguing, or what Mearsheimer said about offensive realism, or what the neoclassical realists are arguing about the working of international politics. So they are all not able to explain the majority of the states. They are talking of only the minority of the states or the small number of states, those who are the major powers, those who are the great powers. But what about the countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America, who are in a different power position and who are facing different kinds of challenges to their security, to their survival? So this aspect was not covered by the earlier variants of realism. Using a post-colonial, post-positivist, neoclassical perspective, Muhammad Ayub, who had given the theory of subaltern realism, he tried to rehabilitate realism as a mainstream higher paradigm. So in a way, by talking about majority of the states belonging to the countries of global south or non-western countries, he is trying to rehabilitate the realist theory, and that in a very substantial way. So Muhammad Ayub, let me just mention here that he was an alumni of Aligarh Muslim University, who is now in the Michigan State University, and he has done a lot of work on this realist tradition, particularly the subaltern realist theory that we are going to discuss now. So how it rehabilitated the realist tradition, that we are going to discuss now. So basically it was able to explain the behavior of the majority of states within the international system and causes of majority of interstate conflict. So on these two issues, earlier realist traditions were limited to their application to small number of states or small number of great powers, and they were not talking of the majority of the states in the global south or non-western countries, and also they were not talking of majority of interstate conflicts. So that these two were the limitations, and these two limitations were overcome by Muhammad Ayub, who in a way rehabilitated realist tradition in international politics. The term subaltern realism is used due to its referring to the less powerful sections of the society that tend to constitute the majority of population. So he is talking of subaltern, or the word subaltern is actually used to understand great majority of countries belonging to Asia, Africa and Latin America, those who constitute majority of population, those who constitute majority of the states, but they were not highlighted by the earlier realist traditions. Ayub points out that most of the states in the present day international system are at the same page of historical development as Florence in the 15th century and England in the 17th century, while also agreeing with the realist notion of system being anarchical and state-centric. So on these 2 points, international system is anarchical and it's basically dominated by state-centric model of international politics. So these are the common points, but on other issues like what are the problems and challenges faced by the developing countries, what are their concerns, how they experience a lot of interstate conflict. So these issues are not highlighted, and that is how he is trying to understand the problem of these countries from historical experience, from the experience of these countries in the post Second World War period, and his understanding of these countries is just like the historical development of Florence in the 15th century and England in the 7th century. So by taking the example of England in the 17th century, or by taking the example of Florence in the 15th century, and by taking the experience of not many countries of global south in the post Second World War period, he's talking of the subaltern perspective in international politics. Basically, his subaltern realism makes 4 key important assumptions about the developing countries. First is the issue of domestic order and international order are closely interrelated, especially in the arena of conflict and conflict resolution. So, Ayub takes a different position. It may be similar to the neoclassical position that, there is a close relationship between domestic order and international order. And if you want to understand the security perception of these countries or security situation in which these countries are placed, you cannot just ignore the domestic factor. So these are all important. So he doesn't accept like the neoclassical realist that there is a domestic divide, rather he combines the domestic with the international. So that is his first major assumption. The second, as a result of the early stage of state building, developing states are vulnerable to the policies of great powers and their institutions. So he's saying that because you are in the early stage of nation building, early stage of state building, so you are vulnerable at this time particularly to the policies of the great powers and also their international institutions like World Bank, IMF and many others. So the point is, I can just give you the example of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, how they are negotiating the loan agreement with the IMF and what are the conditions, and in case they want to accept the loan from the IMF, they have to abide by the conditions. India did it, Sri Lanka and Pakistan are doing now, and maybe the small and medium-sized countries, they will continue to do this. The problem is, so these may not be very stabilizing for your country because you are placed in a very different kind of domestic situation, or your domestic situation is not the same as the domestic situation in many developed countries like America or UK. In 1991, you must have seen how India was undertaking the structural adjustment program that led to India's economic liberalization, and what kind of pressures it was operating in, and what was the kind of policies it was adopting as per the dictates of the World Bank and IMF. So that situation was different for India. So the point is, these kind of great power politics and the institutions like IMF and World Bank, they have a major impact on your domestic situation which you cannot ignore. Third, domestic level variables must receive analytical priority, but when you are explaining the majority of conflicts in the international system, you also have to think about external variables that have to be taken into account because of that destabilizing domestic effect. So the problem is, if you take the example of Syria or Libya, you will find that the question of domestic disorder was considered by the Western countries as a major reason for their military intervention in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So that has an impact on your overall security position. So that we cannot discard, or we cannot reject great power policies, and the external variables, they are not important factor in understanding the interstate conflict. So that is again another major reason if you take the example of Libya or Iraq or even Afghanistan. Finally, Ayub states that the link between domestic and external variables explain the link between intrastate and interstate conflict. So if you want to understand the problem of interstate, or intrastate means within the conflict within the state. So intrastate and interstate conflict can better be understood if you take into account the link between the domestic and external variables. You can take the example of Kashmir. The problem in Kashmir is not just an intrastate conflict, it is also an interstate conflict. As you can see, the policies of Pakistan, how it followed the policy of cross-border terrorism against India since the early 1990s, and there was Kargil war, there was lot of problem between these two countries. So it is not just an intrastate conflict, rather in many of the developing countries, intrastate conflict and interstate conflict, they are interrelated, they influence each other. So there are so many problems so in many of the countries that we have to take into account. So domestic factor and the international factor, intrastate conflict and the interstate conflict, they are all interrelated, they are all integrated with each other. For example, states may attempt to provide aid to diaspora in another state's conflict. If you take the example of India, India provided almost it airdropped 25 million tons of food and medicine in Jaffna in the year 1987. So sometimes if you have a large diaspora in a foreign country, in a neighboring country, and the neighboring country is not following a right kind of policy and creating any problem for its ethnic minorities, so your country it will not just sit idle, it will not just be silent, so it will take a position. And because the national government of Sri Lanka was, in order to control the problem of Tamil insurgency in Jaffna, they stopped the supply of foods, medicine and all essential commodities, and that was that is how India was forced to airdrop the kinds of essential items to that nation, and that created a kind of problem between India and Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka raised this issue also in the United Nations and other international forums. The point is, we cannot say that this is just an intrastate conflict. It has implications for interstate relations, and this factor was highlighted by Muhammad Ayub in his Subaltern Realism. Now Ayub talks about the 5 conflict variables that will help us to understand the security situation in which these countries are placed. He talks about 5 variables that we can study that will actually help us to predict, explain and preventing conflict in these parts of the world. The first variable is the level of state building. When we talk about nation building, we talk about state building. When we focus on nation building, we focus on building of a common national identity. But when you talk of the state building, it's basically your economic development, how you develop the state institutions, how you focus on your education, how you focus on your infrastructure, how you focus on your ports, you focus on your airports. So these are all state making activities or state building activities. So a nation, when you get your national identity, then you focus on your state building projects, state building processes. So the first variable what he talks is about the state building, that was basically the process of making yourself as a modern, as a developed country. The less developed they are, the more likely internal conflict and disorder happens. So the main argument of Ayub is that if you are less developed, if you are still focused on the process of nation building or state building, so this situation may create more problem for you in terms of your security. So that's why this is one of the key variable that will help us to understand your security problem in international politics. The second is the ethnic composition of a state. So most of the countries in the developing world or in the global south, you will find them as multicultural societies, but the problem is they are ruled by monocultural communities. You can take the case of Sri Lanka. There are many ethnic communities in Sri Lanka, but the Sinhalese are the majority and they have a monocultural kind of governance model in Sri Lanka. That is the major reason why the other communities, particularly the Tamils, they are opposing that, because you constitutionally there is the perception that constitutionally there is a lot of discrimination by the majority community against the minority community. Maybe it is about national language, maybe about government jobs, maybe it is about the religion. So there are so many issues on the basis of which there was ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka that created a lot of problem even for India. So the problem is the ethnic composition of the state is also a key variable that will help us to understand the kind of conflict that is going on in these countries. So the third is your contested territory. If that exists between states or groups, then internal and external conflict is more likely to occur. And if you take the example of Kashmir, you will find that it is contested nature of the boundary between India and Pakistan that has led to the problem of Kashmir. There are so many other countries, those who are experiencing the same problem. We had also some territorial problem with Nepal. So the problem is, if the territory is contested, that also put in a very different kind of conflict situation. And most of the developed countries, they are not finding this problem. They have already a very settled kind of border, as you can take the example of Canada and USA. So this is again another variable that we have to understand. Fourth, the great power involvement is also a major variable, as the rivalry between these states can cause domestic conflict in developing countries. Take the example of Syria or Palestine. If the major powers are not involved in these countries, the issue could have been resolved earlier. So the problem is, Israel is and was supported by the United States. The Palestine was supported by the Arab countries, and also the former Soviet Union that also supported the Arab countries in their quest for making Palestine a different country or separate country. So these type of conflicts, or even in you can use this problem in case of India and Pakistan. Had China is not involved in Pakistan, the issue of Pakistan would have been resolved by India many years back. Or if the Americans or the Western countries, they were not involved in Kashmir issue, the issue would have been resolved. The issue is so great power involvement in your issues, that not only complicates your problem, rather it magnifies your problem. It becomes a global issue from a local issue. So this is again an important variable according to Ayub. Finally, Ayub also notes international norms as a variable. They permit the breakup of the states, like the case of former USSR. So if we have different international norms, sometimes these norms are invoked for the disintegration of a particular country, and that may again is another important variable for understanding the security problems of the developing countries. These variables enable the IR theorist to predict and explain internal disorder, with this being a leading cause of interstate conflict in the international system. So if you look at these 5 variables, that will definitely help you to understand how these problems are fighting the problem of internal disorder, or what is the reason for the interstate conflict in this part of the world. So in this way, Ayub's explanation looks more convincing than the earlier explanation of the different other traditions of realism. This further shows how subaltern realism has a superior understanding of the factors affecting the behavior of the developing countries when compared to neorealism, which overlooks these issues due to its narrow focus on the global south. So in that way you can say the focus of neorealism was basically the global north, or you can say only major countries of global north. But what I was saying, what I was explaining, it is about the majority of the countries belonging to the global south or non-western part of the world, and the kind of problems they are facing in their day-to-day life in international politics. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We discussed that neorealism was criticized as it was unable to explain the behavior of majority of states and cause of interstate conflict. Ives subaltern realism makes four key assumptions. First, no great divide between the domestic and international order. Second, vulnerability to great power policies that stems from historical legacies of colonialism, dependence on external aid and investment, and limited autonomy in global decision making power. Third, relationship between domestic and external variables such as the regime type, state capacity, and societal cohesion influence how states interact with the international system and respond to external pressure. And finally, the link between intrastate conflict and interstate conflict such as civil wars and ethnic tensions and interstate relations. You can find that with the best example of the Tamil conflict in Sri Lanka and its impact on India. In the next lecture, we will make a critical assessment of subaltern realism and the unifying elements of different realist traditions like classical realism, neorealism, offensive realism, neoclassical realism, and the last one what we discussed about subaltern realism. So thank you for your attention. Thank you once again.